Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is August 6th. It is Monday, 2018. Tonight's episode is the central bank gold agreements and their impact on the monetary system. We're going to be talking about, in particular, 4 central bank gold agreements. We're going to go through what they mean and what's in their contents and how they impact the amount of gold that central banks have, and how that all impacts perhaps how the gold is priced. But before we get into tonight's topic, let's take a look at the price of gold and silver, both down again. Again, gold at $12.08, and that is down from a high of $12.15, and the high was at the open. Gold down, silver also down to $15.28, again down from the high of $15.42, which also was at the open. Gold and silver have been on a consistent dropping spree for the last 7 or 8 weeks now. Dow Jones, however, continues to forge higher at 25,502, and that's up about 40 points. The Nasdaq making a big rebound at 7,859. That's up 47 points, and it looks like Facebook is clawed back about a half or more of its big drop that it had taken a week or so ago. And the S&P was also up 10 points to 2850. Just a quick word on Facebook. We would be remiss not to mention the banning of the Alex Jones / Infowars channel from YouTube, from Facebook, from Apple, from Spotify today. I believe that Apple was the one to move first, and then it looked like, well, if the $1 trillion Apple company can do it, then they're all going to follow. Now, I would imagine that you would think in a free market that if you want to take the view that these companies are private companies, they can do what they want, they can set their own rules. If people disagree with that, they talk about these companies being almost public utilities, and therefore they need to provide full and fair access. Now, they've done anything but. SGT report was talking about shadow banning today, and this was before the news came out that they actually didn't just shadow ban, but they outright banned Infowars. And the question then becomes, well, will this really be the impetus to move over to alternative platforms? Or are people still going to try to insist that these existing platforms have to provide them with not only a platform, but income from things like Google AdSense? Now, I don't have Google AdSense, but remember, Google AdSense makes money from having the ads too. It's not just you that make money. They split the revenue. Actually, they get a bigger split of it than the content providers. Okay. Let's take a look at the cryptos. The cryptos are also down. Is it time to ban mugs? Mugs are so useful. What might happen is they might confiscate your mug. So make sure that you've got your Smaulgld mug buried somewhere in your backyard. You know, only keep one out, and then the rest, I think you should hoard them. By the way, we're up to 18 reasons why you should buy and hoard mugs. Want to see that? I'll play it at the end of tonight's episode. This will be ad-free. You won't have Google AdSense. You won't have some goofy ad playing at the beginning or in the middle. We're just going to have a nice conversation tonight, and hopefully won't be banned. But by the way, I do invite you to go over to BitChute and sign up there to the Smaulgld channel, because you never know what might happen on this channel. Also, to subscribe to the Smaulgld website. The most important thing I think anyone can do for their favorite content providers, yes, you should subscribe here. And if you haven't done so, hit the subscribe button on Smaulgld. But you should subscribe to the actual websites themselves. That's how you stay in touch with your favorite content providers. And then also, if you want to go one step further, no one is going to be upset if you do indeed also decide that you're going to support those channels, not by just watching and commenting, but also by becoming patrons. Now, I would also say that even Patreon It's nice to be a patron. Certain people have been booted off Patreon too. So it might even be better to donate via recurring via PayPal, or even better than that, donating via Bitcoin or Litecoin or some cryptocurrency. As remember, cryptocurrencies are censorship free. They cannot they can't stop you from receiving a Bitcoin or a Litecoin. They can stop you, your PayPal account. They can stop your Patreon account. Now, I'm not in any danger of that now, but that's not the point. The point is, these are things that you never know. Just gold channels in general, silver channels in general, whatever. Let me take some quick comments before we get into the topic, because it looks like this chat thing may run away. So let me get to the topic, the chats right now. All is One now says InfoWars app was only deleted in the UK, still up in the US. But I don't know if you can get the content. Spokies, is it time to ban mugs? No, as we said, they might confiscate them. So make sure you get your mugs. It's not an ad. You know where they are. They're on Smaulgld.com. All is One now, not until mine comes in the mail. Well, I don't know if did you order one? I don't know whose name that is, but I did send out mugs and erasers this morning. And I also sent out your tracking number. So if you ordered recently, every order that has been in, that has come in up till today, I didn't send out today's orders. I went to the post office this morning and I mailed out erasers and mugs, and I sent out tracking numbers to each and every one who ordered a mug or won an eraser. And every mug that's been ordered since the beginning of time has also been sent out and given a tracking number. So if you haven't received your Smaulgld mug yet, then you should check your tracking number to find out where it is. If not, let me know. They're sent out insured too. So far, this is costing me money, but it's great. I don't mind paying a few extra dollars for people who really want these products. Okay. Yes, I went to the post office. I'm losing pad. Let's see. Harmony, will it be positive or negative for gold if Bitcoin takes a greater safe haven role? I think if people are interested in safe havens, I think they'll both go higher. Yes, I ordered a mug and won an eraser. Well, then check your emails, because I did send out All is One, the tracking numbers and emails to people who did order mugs and to eraser winners. Thinking they just did Alex Jones a huge PR favor. That's possible, Spokies. People like to go after banned content, but there has to be a platform for them to find it. If I was in the CIA, I'd love Alex Jones, make people think any covert ops or nutty conspiracy like destroying Iran's democracy. All right, Bitcoin is also a CIA operation, says Pad. They can get you to buy 7,000, drive it to 5,000, same old, I guess, like gold. Yeah, well, Spokies, SGT is almost a folk hero now. All right, well, let's move on from that. And let's get into the central bank's gold agreements and their impact. Now, the other night, we were talking about what drives the gold price. And I was postulating a new theory, and I think it was along the lines that gold is no longer fully monetized, meaning that the price of gold doesn't necessarily move in relation to typical financial events. And what got me on that kick to start going down that route, not trying to confirm the bias, but taking it based on what I'm seeing, is that in recent years, the jewelry demand is twice the investment demand. And the investment demand for gold is twice the central bank demand. Now, those of you who've been listening to me for a while know I say central banks are buying gold. That is all you need to know. Wrong. Wrong goes star. The central bank demand for gold is very low on an annual basis now. Even though, in fact, it's only in the recent few years that central banks have been buying gold. And the amounts that they're buying are very small, 300 or 400 tons. And it's only 3 of them. Russia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. And we talked about that. All of them are gold producers. All of them have crappy currencies. Makes sense for them to buy gold. So that gives further support for the argument that gold is not as important as it has been in the financial system, and therefore financial style crises don't necessarily boost the price of gold the way they once did. Now, I have some more information today that I did as part of my researching into the 4 gold agreements. Let's go through them. Everyone knows, let's go back to 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement. clearly gold was part of the monetary system. No way, no how it wasn't. The way that one worked is the United States dollar was the reserve currency. If you had dollars, you can bring them to the U.S. Treasury and you can get gold for them straight up, no questions asked. Dollar was as good as gold. Okay. The next thing that happened was the Bretton Woods agreements went away. Nixon said, "The hell with this." United States started running deficits. United States started getting a lot of runs on the Treasury, and they realized now that they were running deficits, small deficits at the time, but still deficits, and France and Germany and Switzerland were sending the warships over and saying, "Here's the dollars, cough up the gold," and then finally they realized this isn't going to work, and Nixon said, temporarily, we're suspending this. Now, the Europeans, for a period of time after that, were always hoping that they would go back to this and that they would bring back the gold standard. Well, that never happened. And the U.S., as you know, and we've talked about this on the channel a lot, is they instituted those petrodollar agreements whereby Saudi Arabia would price and only sell their oil and gold, and that created additional demand for dollars. So if Europeans were thinking, hey, we don't need to hold dollars because we can't get gold for them, we might as well trade in our own currencies. Didn't work because they had to buy oil from Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf state countries. And the United States, in exchange, said, if you price your oil in dollars and you only accept dollars, we'll protect you against the Russians, whoever else might attack you. So that worked, but it wasn't enough. The United States wanted to drive gold out of the monetary system. Now remember, at the time, the United States still had the largest gold hoard in the world in 1972, 1973. And remember, the United States controls the IMF. They have essentially a veto power over any changes, and anytime you want to make a change to the IMF agreements, you need to get 85% vote. So the United States was able to, what was happening after the Bretton Woods agreements, the member states of the IMF, which was basically all the major central banks at the time, they might have fixed their exchange rates to gold. They might have done gold swap type contracts. And the United States did not want to have gold in the financial system. So they finally had an amendment to basically remove, in the Second Amendment of the International Monetary Fund articles, they basically banned the members from fixing their exchange rates to the gold price, and they removed the obligation on members to conduct transactions in gold at the official price. So they were really pushing to get gold out of the system, and a lot of PR work. And if you notice, that continues to this day. The United States, when I went through this, I did research, and over the last 15 years, I looked at all the speeches of the Fed presidents, and you would think they might have reason to mention gold. None of the speeches mention gold in a word search. The only time the Fed ever addressed gold, to my knowledge, was when Ron Paul was a congressman and Bernanke used to give his testimony. Ron Paul used to badger him about gold. But other than that, it's been a very, very concerted effort to downplay gold, drive it out of the system, ignore gold. Now, even though that's what the United States wanted to do, and obviously they have a reason to want to do that because they want people just to say the dollar is the dollar, and that's all you need to know. Clearly, it's in the U.S. best interest to say no gold. Now, the Europeans had a different view. They were of the view, well, no, that's why they tried to continue to trade in gold. They tried to value their currencies in gold. So over time, the dollar ended up getting hurt in the 70s. And by the 80s, however, with the rise of interest rates and the U.S. economy recovering and not being in this funk of hyperinflation or stagflation of the 70s, the dollar started to assert itself. And in the 80s, the dollar index really rose. And course, that pushes gold further out of the way. If gold is, if a fiat currency gets strong and everybody believes in a fiat currency, then the fiat system tends to reign. Now, at the time, up until 2000, Switzerland still had about 60% of its reserves in gold. But when they joined the IMF, they gave up. They sold about 60% of their gold down to about, I think it's the number they still have now, 1,040 ounces. They used to have well over 2,000 tons of gold. They now have about 1,000 tons of gold. And then you had the creation of the ECB in 1998. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the ECB is meant to be, in a sense, a challenge to the Fed. The European countries never quite got over the fact that the United States told them to go pound sand, and they didn't have the power as the German Bundesbank, the French National Bank. They just didn't have it. They thought, in a sense, the ECB, the European Central Bank, would bring back some parity and some way where they could have some say in the system a bit more than if they were just individual European countries. So when that bank was established, they decided they were going to have gold as part of the system. So you had to transfer, individual country transfer assets into the ECB, and the ECB at the time said we should have 15% in gold. Now that's not a lot, and it's still, though, saying we want to have some amount of gold in our asset base. So they clearly want to have gold in 1998, 1999, and the rest of it just going to be the foreign currency stuff, like the other currencies. Now remember, in 1998, they don't yet have the euro. So even though you have a European Central Bank, they don't have euros. You had to put in your lira, Italian lira, your French franc, your German mark, Spanish peseta, and those currencies as part of the mix. And gold has risen since 1998. So as a percentage of reserves, I think more recently it's about 30%. Gold is. But hold that thought. The thought I want you to hold is percentage of reserves and amount of reserves, because we're going to compare reserves to balance sheet in a minute. But let's just keep reserves. So the European Central Bank has a decent reserve position in gold. But remember when I say Russia has about 1,972 tons of gold in their reserves. That is the Central Bank of the Federation of Russia. They've got about 2,000 tons of gold. That is worth about 80 some odd billion of their 460 billion of reserves. Okay, so that's just the reserves. Now, let's go to the central bank agreements and why they're important. So the first central bank agreement, they do these every 5 years, was in 1999. And at the time, the central banks had about, say, about a quarter of all of the world's gold, which is pretty amazing. And earlier, before then, like 5-10 years earlier, they had about 45% of the world's gold. So a lot of the world's gold used to be stockpiled in the central banks. So they would have an enormous impact on the gold if they were to sell it, buy it. Not so much buy it, but if they were to sell it, they can have an impact on the gold price. Excuse me. They were the original whales, as you would think, that if central banks had that much gold, they could sell it, drive the price down. And the ones in the agreements were all the European central banks. I'm not going to list them all. There were 15 central banks. I think that most of them were in the Eurozone, but there are also some other central banks on the periphery of Europe. And those banks, though, the ones who signed on, they had about almost half of the gold, which was about 25% of overall gold. So this is a group of central banks controlling about half of the central bank's gold, if that makes sense. So central banks in general held about 25% of the gold, and these European countries held about 40–50% of the gold. Now, where's the rest of the gold at the time? Most of it was at the United States, but there were other countries that had gold as well that weren't part of these agreements. And the important thing to know about the gold agreements, the first three, they all dealt with them agreeing not to sell certain amounts of gold. Not that they couldn't sell gold, but they would set limits on how much gold they could sell, which is interesting. Which meant that they wanted to keep gold as part of the system, but they didn't want people just to dump the gold, because selling the gold would reduce the value of the gold, and therefore gold wouldn't be part of the system as much, because not only would you be selling it and reducing the amounts of gold that the central banks would have, and therefore the system would have less gold, but also the selling of it would reduce the value. So they came up with agreements in the second agreement, which was 5 years after the 1999 agreement, and they agreed to limit their tonnage that they could sell. The maximum amount that they could sell over 5 years would be, say, 2,500 tons. And they did the same thing again in the third agreement in 2009. It pretty much said the same thing, that there was a limit on how much gold that they could sell. Now, the fourth agreement is important, because the fourth agreement in 2014 said that gold continues to be an important element of gold monetary reserves, and will coordinate our gold transactions. This is manipulation right here. And that they don't have any plans to sell any gold. Now, none of these agreements talk about buying gold. So here's the thing. They have indeed, over time, forget that central banks are buying gold. The amounts that they've bought in the last 3 years do not make up for the amounts that were sold over the last 20. Russia was selling gold. If you go to the website, the Smaulgld website, you'll see Russia was selling a lot of gold in the 90s and early 2000s. But it wasn't just Russia, as we mentioned. Switzerland sold 1,100 tons. UK sold 1,000 or so tons. Central banks were dishoarding gold. But they do want to keep some gold at the central banks. But it's a limited amount. So the fact that there's some central banks, as I mentioned, 3 out of the 150 or so, that are buying gold, there are banks that have limited the amounts that they can sell, but none of the banks that are in the central bank gold agreements, all these European nations, Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, Netherlands, Malta, Cyprus, Latvia, Germany, Belgium, Greece, Ireland, all of these banks that are in this agreement, Portugal, Slovenia, they're not buying gold. If you look, the major central banks are not buying gold. Not England, not Netherlands, not India. Recently bought a couple of tons. But for the most part, they've all agreed that gold is important and that they're going to coordinate their gold transactions so as to avoid market disruptions. That is in the press release of May 19, 2014. The signatories will continue to coordinate their gold transactions so as to avoid market disturbances. And they also note, but doesn't seem like they're obligated to, they do not have any plans to sell significant amounts of gold. And it doesn't look like they are selling gold, but it also doesn't look like they're buying it. Now, that leads me to my point that what they've done is they've put somewhat of an anchor, somewhat of a marker down on gold. And they said, okay, gold's going to continue to be part of the system, even though the United States try to drive it out totally. But it's a lesser and lesser amount of the system, other than if the price of gold rises, then the value of the reserve rises. But here's where it gets tricky. And this is what I wanted to focus on, because it just so happened today that, and I'll put a link tomorrow, that Yardeni Research released its monthly report on the total assets of major central banks. Now, one of the things that we were tracking on what drives the gold price was this concept of, was it the amount of gold in reserves? Was it what central banks were doing? Was it jewelry? Was it GDP? Was it the money supply? Was it the amount of debt? And so on. And one of the things that's very interesting that's happened over the last 10 years is we used to, remember, I wanted you to hold on to the thought of gold as a percentage of reserves. But now, what's happened the last 10 years, that's less important, because when the United States started doing quantitative easing, remember, they took their balance sheet from about less than a trillion dollars all the way up to $4 trillion. And then you had the same thing happen with the ECB. They started driving up their assets, and the way they increase their assets, remember, is not by any organic gain. It's by printing money. So you would think, and it did happen when the United States embarked on its QE, they started printing money, and people started to say, whoa, 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 you are printing money, issuing debt, and therefore, if I'm thinking of gold as a part of the monetary system, we're moving further and further away from a ratio that makes any sense, because each dollar you print creates the inflation, and there's no corresponding value, really, because what the Fed was doing was they were just buying mortgage-backed securities. Half of the QE was mortgage-backed securities, and those were not worthwhile securities. They were useless securities, and they were buying U.S.-issued debt. So, of course, the gold price rose, because people had the concept in 2009, 2010, and 2011 is, this is a no-brainer here. You're increasing the money supply relative to the gold, because there wasn't more gold being mined, and the gold demand was going higher, so it made sense. But as you remember from the other night, we saw that relationship broke down in 2013. Now that to me indicates that the financial system started to value these, quote, assets that the Fed held, and that other central banks started to add to their balance sheet. So for example, the Fed took its balance sheet from less than $1 trillion all the way up to $4 trillion. Now remember, the Fed's balance sheet has been prudent the last 3 years. It's gone down a bit. It hasn't gone up anymore. But what's happened, which is quite remarkable, is that the Bank of Japan went from about $1 trillion 10 years ago up to about $5 trillion. Now this is a smaller country than the United States, and we know how they did it. The Central Bank of Japan just buys, the Bank of Japan just buys every Japanese bond that gets issued. So they have $5 trillion on their balance sheet, according to this Yudeni report. And the ECB started doing QE in 2015 at the Fed's behest, and they're at $5.5 trillion. So these two central banks, and during this time period, this massive increases of assets at central banks, the gold positions in these countries has not gone anywhere. None of the central banks or none of the countries' treasuries that belong to the ECB have added any gold. Bank of Japan hasn't added any gold. And we haven't even talked about China yet. China's also ratcheted up trillions of dollars in debt. Now, that's debt, but what they're saying with these central banks are, when they create the debt, they buy assets. And it's all a shell game, because if the Bank of Japan prints up yen and buys Japanese bonds, I don't see how you've created an asset. But what's happened is the financialization says, yes, they have. So while their gold hasn't gone higher, they claim that they have an asset on their balance sheet of Japanese bond. Now, the European ECB, their assets are a little more tangible, because what they've bought are a lot of corporate bonds. But again, I could see how there is some value in the corporate bonds, because they didn't just print up their own currency and then buy their own bonds. But when you buy corporate bonds, at least there's a company behind it that could conceivably pay you back, because they could conceivably be making products and services that'll enable them to make money and pay you back. But the point being is that then other central banks, like the Swiss National Bank, sells its gold, in effect starts printing francs and buying U.S. stocks. So now these assets that the central bank have, of course they're offset by a liability, they're 5, 6, 7 times higher than they were 10 years ago because they were purchased with debt. But debt that wasn't created from any organic, they just printed the money and then bought the securities or the debt or the corporate security or the corporate debt. And that leads me to believe that the financial system in the last 5 to 7 years has actually believed its own activities, that these are assets now and they don't need to be tied or tethered to a certain amount of gold. Now that's what the United States wanted back in the 70s. Is it, no, don't do that. Don't do that. You just stick to the dollar. Well, this is why I get upset when people complain about the dollar, because these other countries, they finally realize, whoa, we can do this too. I mean, the Bank of Japan is worse than the U.S. For them to have more assets on their balance sheet when the country's half the size in economic value, and for the ECB to have surpassed the Fed, these are worse offenders. And then China is an even more complete mess. So this leads me to believe that the central banks have now, especially the ones who are probably the strongest bulwark against this, the European banks with their gold agreements and trying to keep gold as part of the system and tethering it, they've moved further away from it totally. Japan doesn't really care. It does. I don't know of any documents where Japan even mentions gold or cares about gold. The only countries that seem to care about gold, as I mentioned, Russia definitely does. But Russia, and if you look at Russia, it is completely different in the way it runs. It's not a debt-based central bank. It tries to run a tight ship. China is very, very similar to what the U.S. does, worse. It's actually pretty much doing what Japan's done and what the ECB is doing now. So the whole world is involved in this, hey, let's all consider assets to be what we buy with the money we print. And that is what I believe is taking the wind out of the sails of the gold price, because there's this throwing in the towel and this understanding or agreement that those assets are actually worth something and that you actually can create wealth by printing up your own currency or your region's currency and buying stuff with it and just putting a corresponding deficit on the other side and saying your balance sheet's just growing. But the gold, as part of those overall assets, gets smaller and smaller. So back to reserves versus balance sheet, as a percentage of reserves, the numbers are pretty good because they don't have that many reserves. But then what they do is they pile on their balance sheet by printing their own currencies and buying, quote, assets, many of them of which are just other countries or their own countries' debt instruments that will never be paid, other than if the issuer prints up the money and pays off the bond. So that's where we are, and I think that somewhat explains why the gold price doesn't move. Now, what it does mean, however, is if anyone in the banking system wanted to stop, and this is basically the argument of the emperor's new clothes, is you look at it and you say you don't really have those assets because you bought them with money you printed, and what you bought are, quote, assets that are basically debt that can only be paid if the person or the central bank that issue it can print more money. And that's your inflationary concept that you would say, well, how much gold is there to anchor that? But it seems that they've thrown it all out the window, and the question is, how long can they convince themselves and the rest of the world that this is valid value? Now, what the Fed is doing is they're trying to convince the world, and that's why the dollar is going higher, is, hey, look at us, we're prudent. We don't have zero interest rates. We got 1.75 to 2% interest rates. Come buy our bonds, we'll pay it, and our balance sheet is shrinking. So aren't we prudent? Not recognizing, I mean, you'd have to be a moron not to see it, that they used to have less than $1 trillion in these, quote, assets, and now they're still over $4 trillion. All right, well, that is the monologue for this evening. Let's see if we've got any questions on this. Yes, ASMPR people says Japan's debt to GDP is terrible. They're all terrible. They're all like over 100%, over 200%. And then I don't even like to use the word GDP. What I like to look at is say, because you don't pay debt with GDP. You pay debt with tax revenues. No one calculates that. I don't have the time to go out and figure all that out, but I'd love to see what the debt to tax revenues are. It must be atrocious, because that's how you're going to pay off your debt. If you pay it off any other way, it's not based on production. That's what GDP is supposed to be getting at. But as you know, the GDP numbers, they don't really mean production, because they include a lot of stuff that really doesn't make sense to include it. All right. Alan Greenspan likes gold out of getting out of the Fed GFC. Well, he liked gold before he was in the Fed, too. Many will remember, in 1966, he wrote for Ayn Rand's article, Gold and Economic Freedom or something. I think that was the title of it. But again, he talked about how gold prevented the insidious inflation, and it put a collar around central banks. But that didn't stop him. When he became the chairman of the Fed in 1987, appointed by Reagan, and the stock market down, he was like, okay, we got to fix the stock market. We're going to stand by, ready, willing, and able to inject liquidity, do whatever it takes. He was the original Mario Draghi in that respect. All right, well, I think that about does it. Unless we have, I don't see that we do, any more questions or comments, I am going to sign off in just 1 minute, but I am going to leave you. It's not really for you. I mean, you can sign off now if you wish, but for those people who are going to pick this up on the after this live stream gets uploaded, I'm going to play for them the Smaulgld 18 reasons to buy a Smaulgld mug, and this way they can get to buy their mug. And here we go. Thank you very much for listening. I'll probably stay on till after the 18 reasons to buy and hoard mugs, so if you want to add comments, I may respond to them. Ten reasons why you should buy a Smaulgld mug. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 1. Mugs have been used for drinking for more than 5,000 years. Number 2. They are finding more uses for mugs every day. Number 3. We could not live our lives without mugs. Number 4. The Russians and Chinese are buying mugs hand over fist. Number 5. Mugs are made in China. Number 6. Mugs are hard assets. Number 7. Mugs are real wealth. Number 8. Mugs cannot go to zero. Number 9. Mugs are portable. Number 10. Mugs are drinking vessels, period. Wait, there is more. You can mix Mountain House in a mug. You can carry your barter silver in a mug. You can do many things with mugs that you cannot do with fiat currencies. Measure your wealth in mugs. They have mugs at the offices of JP Morgan and central banks. That is all you need to know. When the excrement hits the fan, you'll want to have your Smaulgld mug close by. Buy your Smaulgld mugs today. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 11. You can stack mugs. As you can see here, mugs are stackable. Add to your mug stack today. Buy a Smaulgld mug. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 12. You can put coffee in a mug. As you can see here, someone very clever has done so. Buy a Smaulgld mug today. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 13. You can put cognac in a mug. As you can see here, someone is thinking of putting cognac in a mug. Buy a Smaulgld mug today. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 14. You can display a mug on a studio soundboard. As you can see here, someone has displayed a mug on a studio soundboard. This highlights how versatile mugs can be. Mugs can be put in countless places, and we intend to show you as many of those places as possible. Buy a Smaulgld mug today. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 15. Mugs do not require electricity. As Smaulgld subscriber Wild Bill points out, mugs will still be usable after an EMP. Mugs do not require electricity. Here is a picture of a Smaulgld mug and another Smaulgld mug. They will look the same before and after an EMP and never require electricity. Buy a Smaulgld mug today. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 16. Mugs are undervalued. The price of mugs is about the same price as it was 10 years ago. This means that mugs are one of the most undervalued assets on the planet. Buy a Smaulgld mug today. Reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Number 17. You can hold your keys in a mug. Keys are very important. You can hold your keys in a mug. As you can see here, someone has put their keys in a mug. Buy a Smaulgld mug. Reasons to buy and hold mugs. Number 18. You can defend yourself with a mug. Mugs make great defensive weapons. In many states, you can open carry mugs. In all states, you can conceal carry mugs. Protect yourself with a mug. Buy a Smaulgld mug today. And there you have it. 18 reasons to buy and hoard mugs. Get yours today. What every man should have. My buddy called me out of the blue to go and buy 6 Krugerrands. He's no gold bug nor a prepper. Known him for 25 years. Last time he bought gold was in 2008. I wonder why. Krugerrands, I think, are 91.67 gold. 91.67. They're like the 22 karat, like the American Gold Eagle. From what I understand from dealers, they're not as desirable. They don't pay on the resale as much as they do for some of the other gold products. Interestingly, the Gold Eagle, even though it's not a 24 karat coin, they actually prefer that on the resale because the 24 karat gold, they say when they want to resell it, they may get little dents and stuff in it, and it may reflect or may detract from the resale value. So that's why the 22 karat, they tend to have a higher resale value. I still think an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold, but apparently not. And if you know your gold history from the coins I used to circulate, they used to be 90% gold, and they were 90% gold, 10% copper, and that again was to keep them from wearing out in circulation because gold, as you know, is a very soft metal. All right, thanks very much for listening. Remember, we're here every night at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Remember to go over to BitChute and sign up there in case we ever get shut down here, and also to subscribe at smaulgld.com. Thank you very much.